might recall that last week Jesus says that just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so too the Son of Man must be lifted up. And so when they hear that term, Son of Man, and then they hear that this is Judgment Day, all the Hebrews would have been thinking back to Daniel and the other prophetic books that were more apocalyptic. In the book of Daniel, the prophet Daniel, it says, one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds. This is the Son of Man. Not one who is like the Son of Man, but this is the Son of Man. And so most of the Jewish people would be thinking this is the end times. And of course, Jesus goes from there and goes into this gospel about wheat. It's fascinating. If you think of the gospel in practical terms, in realistic terms, I mean, they're not just stories. These were real people and situations. It says some Greeks wanted to meet Jesus. In other words, this is a first impression. They want to meet Jesus. And so they talk to the one apostle, and he takes them to the other one, and then they both lead him to Jesus. And it happens to be the day that Jesus is saying, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground, unless you hate your life, you will lose it. And all these horrible things. I mean, talk about first impressions. They probably say, come back another day. Like he'll say good stuff another day. This is pretty harsh. But make no bones about it. Jesus is using this metaphor of the wheat because everybody understood it. So I did not understand it. I don't know about harvesting wheat and the like, even though I see wheat fields. If you go through the country sometimes, you'll see them all over the state. And so I did a search on it, and WikiHow, which apparently is a website that can teach you many things how to do, I looked up harvesting wheat, and it came up and it said, step 1, make sure your tractor and combine are in good working order. Well, it didn't give me what I wanted. So I said, how about harvesting wheat back in the time of Jesus? And it seems like there were 3 phases to this. First of all, you go out and you harvest the wheat. So they had something like the sickle. You see the Grim Reaper with that sickle. And above that blade on the sickle, there were almost like 3 other blades with, well, they were curved pieces of wood. They had no sharp edge on them. And they would go out with this, and they would sweep through the wheat. And not only would it cut down the wheat, but also those other little curved pieces would kind of bundle it up. So they'd make one sweeping move, cut the wheat, bundle it up, and then just leave it there and do the next area. So it would be in these little piles. And they would then bind these piles together, and they called them sheaves. And they'd leave them in the field for about 10 days so that they could season, which was kind of risky because apparently if they got wet and then they dried out again, it might ruin the whole crop of wheat. So it was really weather dependent. Step 1. Step 2 then, those sheaves are brought in. You might have heard of bringing in the sheaves. So they bring in these sheaves and they take them to the threshing floor. And for threshing, they spread them out and they have an oxen or a donkey or something pulling this heavy board, this platform that's rough on the bottom. And what it does is it kind of rolls out all these stems and gets all the little kernels of wheat off. So that's the threshing floor. Once the threshing is done, they hand it over to the winnowers. And the winnowers have these winnowing fans. They look like giant rakes. And what they do, they kind of scoop up what's left and they kind of toss it in the air like they're fanning someone. And all the chaff blows away. And what you're left with is the kernels, the wheat berries. Now from there, you can either give them to the planter who will take the wheat berry, the seeds, and hold them until next year where they can bear more fruit. They'll plant them as crops and they'll yield 40, 60, or 100-fold, as Jesus says with the sower and the seed. Or they next hand it over to the miller, and the miller takes the millstone and will grind it down to flour and make bread, and that is their staple. So Jesus is giving this example, knowing that everyone in his audience understands how to harvest wheat. They would have celebrated the festival of wheats, and at the end of that, they celebrate Shavuot. And Shavuot is when they go out and they harvest the wheat. But he says it about himself, more or less. Remember, he says the Son of Man will be raised up like the serpent on the pole in the desert. And then he goes into this whole speech about, Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it becomes just a grain. So let's follow this through now. Because throughout the Passion that we're going to read in just a few weeks, Jesus is handed over. He is passed on. The Greek word is paradidomai. He was handed over. So the soldiers and the chief priests handed him over to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, the tribunal. The tribunal hands him over to Pilate. Pilate hands him over to Herod. Herod hands him back over to Pilate, who says, go and crucify him yourself. Hands him back over to the chief priests, who cannot kill anyone with capital punishment. So they hand him back to Pilate, who hands him to the torturers, who hands him to the people who will help him to carry the cross up to Calvary until he dies. And then he is handed over to Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, who will place him in the ground. And that seed that has died and is placed in the ground will bear the fruit, which is the church. Jesus is that grain of wheat that falls to the ground and dies. And not only will it bear fruit that becomes the church, but think about it. Jesus puts his very essence into what? A piece of bread that is made from the ground wheat. He puts his essence into a piece of bread, which was the staple of the people. He goes on to say, if you love your life, you will lose it. And if you lose your life, you will save it. He goes on to say, where I am, there my servants will be. In other words, we are supposed to follow suit. We have choices. And we are like that seed. We are that grain of wheat. And we can stay protected in a nice shell, and nothing will ever touch us. And if you take one of those little wheat grains and you put it in an envelope in a drawer somewhere, it'll stay forever. It'll stay forever. Nothing will touch it. Or there are other options. If the grain of wheat falls to the ground, then it bears fruit. And if we give of ourselves in that way, that's sacrifice, it's not selfishness. It's quite the opposite. If we give of ourselves in that way, that if we die to self and die to ego and all those things, then we will bear much more fruit than we will if we're placed in an envelope and kept in a drawer, nice and safe. Or if we allow ourselves to be used to help nourish others. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea here because you're in school right now. So to be able to give yourself completely and just walk away from school, I have a lot of upset parents, I imagine, and professors and everyone else. Within our vocation, whatever that vocation may be, we are called to die to self. We are called to serve others. And based on that, we bear much fruit. So if you are a father or a mother, part of your 40, 60, or 100-fold yield will be your children, and those within your family, and those you affect on the day-to-day. So it's not like an all or none. Remember, virtue is always in the middle. It doesn't mean we have to give our whole self, although there were those who did that. St. Catherine Drexel gave her whole self to the missionary and the teaching of children. Oscar Romero, even though he didn't have to, really entered into being a bishop and gave his whole self to the people of El Salvador. Mother Teresa, who didn't feel the presence of God for over 50 years, but day in and day out gave her whole self, so that others, the poorest of the poor, might survive. Damian Malachi in Hawaii, who decided to serve the lepers on that island and eventually contracted leprosy himself because he gave his whole life to them. And there's saints in the church. We're not called to just walk away from our life and give everything unless we feel that is our vocation. You don't want to leave your children tomorrow and go start a missionary in some foreign place. We have responsibilities. But how much can we empty ourselves of self and extend it out to those who might benefit most from that? I know we don't do it. It's really safe. It's safe and secure because whenever we put ourselves out there, we always risk rejection, but we risk getting hurt, taken advantage of. And so we might say, well, if I put myself out there and I'm only, yielding 40-fold or 60-fold, is it really worth it? We can't ask that question. We just put ourselves out there in this life so that the Lord can welcome us into the next. I think this was really well put. There's a book by C.S. Lewis called The Four Loves. And he talks about people who will not put themselves out there. They will not risk love because it's safer just to stay protected. And this is what he says. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. So if you want to make sure, keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in this casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. And so we are created to be able to give. Love, the definition of love in itself, is to be able to offer ourselves to another, what we have to offer to another. As we get closer and closer to the celebration of the Passion, it's a good time to look at our life and ask what we have done with the gift that God has given us. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground, unless the ego is shed and selfishness and all these things which distance us from others, it's going to always remain isolated, just a grain. But if it dies, great things can happen. Let us offer that